last year without anyone but Maryam and her tailor taking much notice, but the holiday in London had accelerated it. All that chocolate and ice cream and fast food had settled in unexpected places and brought with it the discomfort of underwired bras and a body that felt unknown. For a while in London, she thought she had lost the ability to judge her own dimensions, which was why her breasts kept bumping into strangers, until she realized it was almost never women with whom she was making the unexpected contact. Once understood, she didn't know how she felt about it. Sometimes she wanted to cry, other times she was triumphant. It was purely humiliating, though, to overhear her father tell her mother that she needed to go to Oxford Street and buy their daughter an entirely new wardrobe because all her clothes looked indecent. So out went her favorite shirts. The Madonna one, the tiger with diamante eyes one, the nautical striped one. The new shirts were looser fitting and without images or ornamentation that might draw people's eyes to her chest. It made little difference to the men bumping into her on the tube or to that friend of her parents who'd started squeezing her shoulders affectionately and pulling her close, the way her uncles had always done, but never him. The previous summer in London, she had imagined visibility was what she wanted. In Karachi, men stared if you were a girl. It was something to which she was accustomed and shared with every other girl in the city. In London, people looked through you. The contrast was disquieting. "Notice me, notice me, notice me," she chanted internally when walking down the streets. And now, wish granted, she had passed into a new category of person, her relationship to the world around her altered. At the same time, everything seemed to carry on as it always had. There was no one in London she could talk to about this. Only on that first day of school back in Karachi during break time, watching Zahra reach over the heads of students standing in front of her to pay the man in the tuck shop for 2 bottles of Coke and 2 packets of chili chips, did it all make sense. There had always been a joke at the heart of their friendship, a gag that appeared first at the visual level before revealing itself to run through many layers. Now, there was Zahra, all straight lines, and Maryam, all curves, adding another element to their study in contrasts. I think I'll stop there for the moment.
Great, that's wonderful. I didn't get a chance to say to you in the fake green room how much I love this book and how happy I am to be talking to you about it. It's wonderful. And that bit that you just read is a terrific sort of amuse-bouche for the reader, I think. It's really representative of the book in so many ways. Always when I do an event with a writer, I always feel a little strange. I try to sort of thread the needle for people who have read the book and for people who haven't, so as to not bore the people who've read it and, ruin things for the people who haven't. But I'm just sort of wondering if you can tell us, do you have a way that you've been describing the book even to yourself when you were writing it or to interviewers now?
Well, I start with the way the novel, the origin point of the novel, which is, I think, something that runs quite deeply through the whole book. And it's a conversation that I had with my sister when we were in our 20s, which is a while ago now. And she said, the friends we make as adults are our friends because we have something in common. But our childhood friends are our friends because they've always been our friends. And that struck me as quite true when I was in my 20s, and it strikes me as particularly true now that I'm in my 40s. So that line was sort of, swimming around in my head. And then in 2016, there was this thing that was in the air. There was Brexit on one side of the Atlantic, there was Trump on the other side. And you were hearing a lot of people say, I can no longer speak to this person who's always been in my life, whether it's a family member or a friend, right? You're nodding. We all know these conversations. And suddenly it was as though these differences that people had always known existed. No one was surprised by the differences, I don't think, but it had always been possible to navigate your way around the differences, and suddenly it wasn't. And I remember thinking about that comment of my sister, and this idea came to me that I wanted to write a story of a childhood friendship that starts so early on that the girls don't remember why it started, or its reasons for existing in the first place. I mean, by the time we meet them at 14, they've already been friends for 10 years. And I wanted to show, even in the early stages, that they're very different people, but they're bound together by love and by loyalty and by shared joy in George Michael, which is an important component of a friendship, and the novels of Jackie Collins. And then they grow up and they continue being very different, and in fact become more and more different. And that difference, works its way through all aspects of their lives, including their professional selves. And they're still fiercely loyal to each other and they love each other. But it becomes impossible to ignore the difference. And really, as I was writing it, the question for me was, what will happen to the friendship? I didn't know, and I had to sort of write the novel to find out what would happen if you really test the novel and make it impossible for them to continue pretending that it doesn't matter how different we are or how differently we view the world.
I love that you didn't really know at the beginning. Sometimes I'm always surprised. I'm surprised when I hear a writer say they know exactly where they're going, which seems to me kind of like a treatise more than what I look for from fiction. The sort of, I have a desire to be open-ended in a way when I'm writing, to not really know. But I think the theme of friendship is one of the great themes for a novel, because friendship is kind of passion. And you have this great quote in the book, actually, about this. You say, "The funny part, of course, is so many women my age rely on their friends far more than their partners for everything from emotional support to belly laughs. But when we talk about people's private lives, that isn't ever what we mean." So you're elevating this notion of friendship and the differences to something really extraordinary in this novel. So to one degree, it's about how different they are. But what else is it? What joins you when you meet so young?
So here's the thing about childhood friends. They're the first people you choose, right? They're the first people you decide to form relationships with and love. You don't choose your parents. You don't choose your siblings. You don't choose your neighbors. Your childhood friends are the first people you look at and decide you want to be with this person rather than all the other people in the classroom. And you want that person to want to be with you. So in some way, actually,
you don't even know why necessarily, right?
You don't know why. I don't think you know why. And in some way that means it is from that springs every other friendship, every other relationship in which you choose a person comes from childhood friends. And that mystery in it, there is a mystery, and there is, I like the way you use the word passion, because it's such an interesting thing, friendship. There is a romance to it. Not all friendships, but to a lot of friendships, there is that moment you meet someone, you think, you get me, or I like how I feel when I'm with you. I like the conversations we have. I want to talk to you more. And sometimes you'll neglect your older friends because this new exciting romance of friendship has come along, and then the friendships get older and you realize each other's flaws. And that, of course, is the test of the friendship.
Well, this friendship is very electric between these two girls. It's very electric, really, from the start when we see them. And the shorthand, I love how you do sort of lard in popular culture in this way throughout the book. It gives us a sort of time capsule, but it's more than that. It's not just sort of decoration. It's the things, it's the sort of language that young people have with each other is often around shared cultural points. And they certainly have that.
Yeah, I mean, someone said to me the other day, how did you recall being around that age? Because the girls are, it's 1988 in Karachi, they're 14, I was 15.
Yeah.
And so even though they aren't based, I mean, I made them up because that was the fun of it, but the context in which they're living is very much the context I remember. And someone said to me, what was the process of recollection? And I said, it's very straightforward. I listened to music from 1988 and I'm 15 again. Put on Tracy Chapman's Fast Car. And I remember that particular feeling of being in Karachi, at a time when there wasn't youth culture around, there weren't a lot of public spaces and events. And so what you could do was get in a car with your friends and play Tracy Chapman and drive through Karachi streets at night just singing and being with your friends. It was something so elemental and significant that, actually you put me in a room with my friends now and play Tracy Chapman, and we'll all sort of start having
good seizures, I hope.
good seizures, yeah.
That good kind. Well, do you think writers, do you think writers remember the past differently from non-writers, or do you think it's just that they then do something with it?
I think if you remember something for the purpose of writing it, something changes in your brain. So one of the significant things that happens in the novel, it starts in August 1988, which is when, the sort of last days of dictatorship in Pakistan, although we had no way of knowing it was the last day. And, it just that one day a bomb exploded on a plane carrying the president, Zia ul Haq. And I have often thought back to the moment I found out. And it was the phone rang. And I answered, and my aunt was on the phone, and she said, "Are your parents there?" And her voice was quite excited. And I said, "No, they've gone out." And she said, "When they come back, tell them to call me. Tell them General Zia ul Haq has been killed. His plane exploded." And I said, "Okay." And I hung up the phone, and my parents came home, and an hour passed, and 2 hours, and several hours passed. And then my mother came running into a room which I was sitting in with my father. This was much later in the day. And she said, "Zia's dead." And I said, "Oh, I knew that." My parents, in their life, have never looked at me so aghast and said, "Why didn't you say anything?" And I said, "Oh, well, Aunt so-and-so is always making up tall stories and exaggerations." And this is the story I have told myself until the moment I was sitting down to write about that day in the novel. And I was writing about Zahra hearing the news that she's dead, and she's disbelieving. And that is the moment I realized, oh, of course, the reason I didn't repeat it to my parents, the reason I sort of put it out of mind, wasn't that my aunt wasn't credible. I couldn't believe it. This man had ruled since I was 4 years old. It didn't seem to me possible that in an instant he was gone and now life would be without him. And I didn't know that until the writerly part of my brain looked at that memory.
It's amazing. The characters of the sort of political figures in the book appear in a way like characters. The meaning of Benazir Bhutto getting into power. Do you think that political figures are like characters in a novel world, sort of either stuck in living? Do you feel that way sometimes, that we all sort of see them and have a transference toward them?
Well, I think of late we've started to say, what are fiction writers and satirists going to do when we look at our politicians? But I think, certainly for the two girls, and this was also to some extent true of me, but for the two, we'll talk about them rather than me, to be an adolescent girl in a world where power had only ever been male, and to then see this 35-year-old woman voted into power, which means this country, this deeply patriarchal country, votes in a woman. And for the two of them, it does upend everything, and she does become a character, but she's not like a human character. She becomes instantly this myth. And she changes the way they see their own possibilities, because they look at her and they think a thought they have never had before. Well, Maryam might have had it slightly, but it gets enhanced, and Zahra certainly hadn't it. And the thought anything is possible for a girl.
Yeah. So what do you think about that line? Anything is possible for a girl. How do you approach that now?
Well, the second half of the novel is in 2019, and there's only about 2 lines of reference to Benazir Bhutto, but the 2 lines are, she was assassinated, and that the girls weep, and they remember what it felt like when they were 14. And in the novel itself, there's Benazir comes into power, and that night there's a school party, and we're not going to get too spoilery, but I think we can say this much is and they are filled with this feeling of anything is possible for a girl, and therefore our lives today can't be the same. They want to do something different, and Zahra in particular, who's always been very careful in how she behaves and what she does, just has a sense of possibility. And she does something and Maryam follows. And they're in one of those situations, and I've talked to a lot of women I know about this moment in the novel, and I don't give them specifics, but I just say, you know, that moment where you're a woman, and particularly I think when you're younger, this is more likely to happen. And you get into a situation, there's a younger man you met, I mean, as in a young man, he's a little older than you, and you don't know him hardly at all, or maybe not at all, and the atmosphere is just sort of crackling with possibility and excitement. And then something happens, and it's not even something big. It could just be a gesture or a look or a shift in the air, and suddenly a switch in your brain goes on and you're terrified.
Yes, it's like a change in room temperature too, right? It's like a sudden chill or something.
Yeah.
You know, when you talk about the excitement, you have a line in the book after Benazir Bhutto gets in. I learned then that you should never believe a fight is lost, no matter how many years go by without a glimmer of hope. So do you, this is maybe jumping out of the book and into a more general question, but I'm going to go right back into the book. Do you have to feel hopeful to be a writer?
Well, to be a writer, you have to imagine different things, different to the things right in front of you. And that is not always hopeful in and of itself. I mean, the things you imagine could actually be very grim. You could be imagining something dystopian. You could be imagining, you know, what's going to happen with the climate catastrophe 20 years down the line. But I think there is something in that act of being able to imagine different versions. And of course, as writers, what we do is we say, well, you know, let's take the plot in this direction. Then we stop and say, well, or we could change this detail and it goes in that direction. And I think that is actually where the hope is that understanding of you can swerve it, but there is also that moment in the life of a novelist, and you can disagree with me, Meg, but when you're writing your way to the ending of something, and you know, there've been a couple of times when I've written novels and then people say, God, that didn't end well for anyone. And I thought, well, and I will inevitably say, well, I didn't realize that was going to happen. I kept thinking I'll find a way at the last minute to, you know, make it more optimistic. But there is a point where the trajectory becomes inevitable, and it's false to do anything different with it. But that's a really late point in the trajectory. And there are always these moments, and there is, you know, the girls grew up into very different women with different ideas of power and history and what can be changed, but they both do have a sense that things aren't entirely fixed. And I think that does come from having lived through a moment. And I think it's really, I'm so glad now that I, like them, lived through a moment where actually very abruptly things changed, and things didn't change as much as they thought. So they still do find themselves living in girls' bodies that are vulnerable and feeling what Maryam refers to as girl fear, that moment the switch comes on. And yet something has changed.
Well, there is a quote also, Benazir Bhutto taking the oath of office felt very far away. You could do anything to a woman on this street and no one would stop you. So this sort of dissonance between a very hopeful sense that things will change and someone is in power, but the very real ongoing truth about what it means to be a girl or a woman in this world, right?
Yeah, there is, but there's also, there is that duality of things. It's sort of the switch goes on, the switch goes off, and you know, that you aren't going to be in one moment of hope forever, but you're also, you know, that moment of girl fear also won't last forever. And the question is how you navigate your way through these moments, you know, and what happens when you get older, and that becomes a question for them. I mean, when they're 14, they don't have a lot of agency.
No.
Once they're older, they do in very different way acquire power. And then the question that I was interested in is, what will they do with it?
I think one of the things that's so interesting about reading or even writing about teenagers is that it's a time of firsts. It's a time of things happening for the first time to all these people. So it has a certain thrilling quality to it. But later, as we get older and you make that wonderful jump from, I guess, 1988 to 2019, I feel in a way, what I love about that is that it's no longer a time of firsts, of course, it's 18ths or 30ths, but these are the same people, right? I mean, so when you're writing back and forth in different time periods with the same character, did you have a sense of just being in the same person, or did they seem different as they got older?
They were very much adult versions of their childhood selves, in some ways unexpected and in some ways not, which is the truth of all our lives and the lives of everyone we've known through childhood, that you can sort of trace a line back, but you can also say, oh, but I wouldn't have expected this to turn out that way. So there were, in the writing of them, there were characteristics that perhaps when they were younger were more buried, and then as they're older sort of come out in particular ways, or things they didn't know about themselves when they were very young. Particularly this moment when we see them at sort of the awakening of sexuality in a way that is so, it just knows, I'm sexuality and I'm awake. What is this? Beyond that, they have no understanding of it, or no understanding of really what to do with it even, except sort of be in it and be a little startled and a little curious with a hint of shame and secrecy around the edges of it. And then when you see them in their later life, it was actually I enjoyed the process of having them be women in their 40s who are now absolutely comfortable, with what their different particular sexualities are. And I think they probably surprise each other and themselves in all kinds of ways, but it did feel to me very much like an organic process. And partly that was Meg. I can reveal the secret, which is I wrote some, of the in-between years for myself.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so I saw them in their 20s and 30s. So I saw this process of becoming, and it was sort of really useless writing for the purpose of a novel, but I mean, for the purpose of a reader. But it was quite useful for me, so I could see how they went from one stage to the next.
Do you often do that? Do you have sections of novels that are really end up only being for you, the little chapbook for you?
Well, I mean, the truth is I don't start off thinking I'm writing it only for me. I think this is what the novel is going to be. And then at a certain point, I realized, no, this is just not very interesting that the story lies elsewhere. And so there've often been periods where I've written something thinking it's going to go in the novel and then realizing, no, this is first draft writing for me stuff.
You're making a point, though, about that, the wonderful sort of leaps in fiction, I think. I mean, I sometimes find when I've taught writing, there are moments where writers, when they're beginning, kind of want to show people walking across the room as if the reader, and I, did this myself, of course, when I, was younger. You don't really believe that the reader will understand that they did leave that restaurant. You need to say that. And I think in a way, showing the leap, from being a teenager to being a woman, a fully powerful, sexually, mature person is like a leap of faith like that too, that you didn't quite take maybe, and then you did.
Yeah, it feels very much like a leap of faith, and it feels like you're sort of saying to the reader, sort of, trust me, come with me, and you hope they do it. And the second part of the novel starts with Zahra is sitting on a park bench with one booted leg crossed over the other, sipping a cup of coffee, waiting for Maryam to turn up. And that image was in my head very, very early on. And I always, not always, but at a certain point in that early section, I knew that whatever happens to them when they're 14, they will reach this moment where they are comfortable in their skin in their 40s. And then, but of course, because I'm a writer, I make them comfortable in their skin only to then to throw in some discomfort. Yeah. So in some way, I think what I was saying was, I was less interested in that process of how you go from kind of the teenager who's just trying to figure things out to the confident woman. And I was more interested in But what happens when you think you've reached that point where everything is now okay? I've figured it out. You know, the 40s are wonderful in as much as there's a lot of stuff you stop worrying about. I mean, not for everyone, but for a lot of women I know, and for myself, there is a kind of confidence that comes, or an ease in your skin. But of course, it's not the end point. That's still just another stage of life.
I know. Would that life was like a novel, right? And we're like now reaching the point where everyone is happy, and then that's it. It doesn't.
Yes,
It doesn't really
I'm
work.
not gonna, there is a way in which you could end with Zara sitting confidently on the bench, but I don't know. I want to do the more interesting thing, which is pick them both up when they're confident and at ease in their skin, but then show that all the stuff that is under the surface, which they thought they had sort of, I don't know, grown out of or thought their way out of, or it doesn't matter, that it's still sort of there waiting, and it just needs the right combination of events to sort of bring it all out again, because there's still switches that can be switched on and off in you.
That's right. Yeah, you feel that very much. Speaking of these two characters, because it really is a book about, I don't know if I want to say you're a character-based writer. I don't know who isn't. Well, maybe some people aren't really, but do you consider yourself one? I guess I would ask. Is character primary for you?
I think, you can't have a novel without characters living and breathing. For all that there may be, there may be abstractions you're interested in, there may be ideas you're interested in, but your characters have to live and breathe, and whatever else is happening happens through them. So yeah, I would say, I mean, and this novel is very much about the two of them, and a third character, which is not a separate thing, which is their friendship.
Yes.
Which is almost like a character they know and they think about. And sometimes they think about in very idealized ways. And other times they get sort of a little impatient with, but they do have a sense of their friendship as this thing that they have carried through their entire lives.
It almost, thinking about it now, it almost feels like a sort of performance in which at one point one of them gets a solo and another one, watches, and the other one gets a big solo, and they share that kind of power.
Yeah, that's a lovely way of putting it.
There's a line in an essay, a wonderful essay by Zadie Smith called Fail Better. I don't know if you know it, about the novel. And she says, when I write, I'm trying to express my way of being in the world. And I love that description. And I wonder if you relate to that as a writer, if that's something that you think maybe that you're trying to do with your books.
Meg, I never really know what I'm trying to do with my books. I mean, or at least I don't know as a whole what I'm doing with them but I know that they come from somewhere very deep inside, that there has to be something that I have been thinking about for years, and it finally I can only make sense of it, not by thinking of it as me, but actually having other characters move through certain situations and grapple with certain things and live all kinds of contradiction. And by watching them, I understand something that I would never have understood if I was just sitting in my own brain as me, if that makes sense.
Yes, absolutely. Well, because that line by this one, that one, but the Emily Dickinson line, "Tell all the truth, but tell it slant." I think art does that, right? I mean, it allows us to sort of understand things for ourselves because it's being told not necessarily in the linear, Wikipedia way, but in some other way.
Yeah.
Are you free? Go ahead. Sorry.
No, so, and sometimes I'll start a novel and move sort of closer to an answer. And with this one, I think I moved closer to understanding the impossibility of answering certain kinds of questions, like, should you carry on being friends with people whose ethics are dissimilar to yours. And I realized, well, how do you answer this question? And there's, for me, if there is a key moment in the novel, it's quite late when Zahra is very angry with Maryam, and they're both grown women, and she's finding Maryam intolerable and damaging. And she calls up her father, and it's very crucial that both their sets of parents are in Karachi and they're in London. And her father says, well, here's the thing you need to realize about your friend Maryam. He says, your mother and I have decided the day one of us dies, the first call the other one will make will be to Maryam. And we've told her this, and she has said whatever she's doing, she will buy 2 plane tickets and she will fly back to Karachi with you, because she will not let you make that journey alone. And it's the impossibility of holding that question with one hand and trying to weigh it up against, but you are doing incredible damage and who you are in so many ways is unacceptable, that actually it's impossible. Right.
I'm glad you singled that moment out, because I circled it for myself. I thought that was an incredible moment, the understanding of what the friendship means to the two of them. The passion, again, going back to what we sort of touched on earlier, but also, yes, the impossibility too. I feel like when you're children, at least for me, maybe this is different from you, I never really understood that that you wouldn't always be with your closest friends. There could be that lots of time and oceans could divide you, and that it wouldn't be like childhood, which is like a marriage, because you're with each other every day if you were in school together, right? But this sense of sadness, I think, and adding to that, the sadness of, if you're really, really different and it's unacceptable, what then?
Yeah.
Did you set that? So when you began to write, did you have sort of very, in a concrete way, a question like that you wanted to solve or just explore?
Well, my question was, what will happen to their friendship once they have to really face their differences?
So that so you did know that right away.
I knew that was a question. I didn't know how it was going to come up. I didn't know what kind of differences they would be. But I knew that was somewhere in there. And yet, as I went on, actually, I became more interested in the impossibility of an answer than anything else. And what that impossibility of an answer actually tells us about the mysterious nature of a friendship. Because, of course, the thing about friendships is you can break them so easily and walk away. It's not the same as being in a relationship with someone who you're living with, or being in a relationship with someone who you're professionally entangled with, or who you share family with. Of course, sometimes a friendship group can be its own family, but there are a lot of friendships where it's a sort of one-on-one thing, and you can just decide, I'm not going to return your call, I'm not going to see you, and that's it. And it can end so quickly and finally and abruptly. And there's something terrifying in that. But the other side of it is, you can have many, many friends. And you can also say that, it's one of the differences. I think in childhood friends, you feel it's so important to have the best friend. You must have the one best friend. And if your best friend should ever choose another best friend to supplant you, it's the end of the world. And then when you're older, you realize that you can have actually different friends who you go to for different purposes and reasons. But I think what's interesting is, if you've still held on to the childhood best friend, there's still a little bit of that in some essential way, you have to be my best friend.
You're reminding me of a traumatic experience in my adolescence, where I was friends with a girl who, on her wall, her parents let her do this. She painted in order a list of who her favorite friends were. Like, you would show up one day and you're not.
Have you written about this?
No, because it's too clearly. But and then I would show up, and then I'd been painted over and like drop down to number 7. And you would walk into the room not knowing. And she had that kind of power. But power, I'm returning to that word again. We touched on it only a little bit. I think you're very interested in that as a writer. It comes up a lot. What is novels, what is it about power? Is it that it's elusive, or what?
I think it's that there's so much of it everywhere. It's, it's in It's in class, it's in money, it's in gender, it's in sexuality, it's in race. There are all these, we live within so many power structures. And, the two girls, they are sort of class adjacent.
Yeah.
They're not exactly in the same class. They're not in vastly disparate classes, but there's just enough of a difference for them at 14 to be aware of it. To be aware that Maryam goes abroad for her summer holidays and Zahra never does. And it gives them different relationships to power. So we live so firmly and deeply within these structures of power, and then we navigate relationships in them and through them. And sometimes the power structures can be very evident when you're talking to each other, and other times they seem to disappear and then they reappear. But I'm also interested in what it does to us as human beings when certain kinds of power come to us, and we have it, because as children we all know powerlessness. Everyone has an experience of powerlessness. And then, sort of as you're growing up, you're either moving to greater and greater powerlessness or greater power, or you're more likely shifting between them. And it's so interesting to me the way I think power is the subtext in so many conversations and dynamics and relationships, and very often we don't quite want to look at it or acknowledge it for what it is. But it's there in all kinds of ways, yeah.
You can hear it in dialogue between two people, not even knowing who they are to each other. The way a parent might speak in a very domineering way to a child, in a way that you would not accept from anyone else except a parent, because you don't think you have agency beyond that. But what's interesting to me here is not only the way you address power, but their own sort of dawning, burgeoning awareness of power. Like we almost feel as children that we are all the same, but then we realize that luck and fate and class and all kinds of issues come into play. And that awareness is in this book very much.
It is, and they're aware of it because they are so close, and yet their families inhabit different relationships to power. And they just know from a very early age. And, it's this interesting thing where Zahra sees Maryam and Maryam's family having power. She doesn't want that kind of power, but she understands that power itself brings a lot with it. And that's something she knows very early on. And she wants to sort of leave and go away, because to her sort of family surroundings are not ever going to give her the power she wants. Whereas for Maryam, it's very much she wants to stay exactly where she is, because she wants to stay in the heart of her family's power. And then, of course, they both have to forge, their ways of being powerful. But now, as women who are migrants, they are Pakistani Muslim women in Britain, and there are all kinds of power structures. And the other thing they know, and I think this doesn't get talked about enough. Certainly, it gets talked about a little with gender, but not with race and class in the same way. There are ways of playing power to your advantage, which Maryam does. She'll play that, you want a woman, you want a brown woman to make you look good. I'll be that brown woman. You give me certain things in return.
So power and complicity.
Yeah.
In the book, for sure. One quick question before we turn it over to questions from the audience. Do you feel powerful when you're writing? Is writing a powerful act for you?
Oh, what a good question, Meg. There's a way, of course, when you write, you want to disappear. You want to not think of yourself and what you're feeling, except what your characters are feeling.
Yes.
And so you're feeling what they are. But there is, oh, Meg, that moment where you write that sentence or that paragraph, and that this is the one you've been struggling with, and today you got it right.
Yeah.
And you can get up from your desk and, my God, the world is wonderful that day.
Yes, those days are few and far between, but they are so wonderful. They're extraordinary.
Yeah.
I know exactly what you mean. And I think readers sometimes know a passage. They know that the writer felt that way.
Yeah.
Reading a certain passage, they can tell.
Yeah.
It's filled with power. Yeah, it's infused with it in a way. So moving on to our audience, here's a question for you. How did you choose the names for your characters? Do they have significance?
Yeah, it's a weird one, isn't it? You have to find the names that fit them. And I don't know, sometimes people will sort of look at my novels and say, oh, and this word means this. And I think, oh, I had no idea what it meant. I don't go and look at the meanings of names, but it's just how, a name conjures up a personality. They were always Maryam and Zahra. And I think I found them very early on, their names. And that doesn't always happen. Sometimes you search, but yeah, I don't know why. But Maryam was always a Maryam and Zahra was always a Zahra.
It's that thing, right? It's hard to explain. Yeah. How close to your original idea did your novel end up being? How often did you stray from the original plan? Did you start with a theme and go from there? And if so, how did you come up with that theme?
Well, so as I said, the idea of take a childhood friendship and then move it through the decades and put a certain kind of pressure on it to see what happens, that was always there. And I think I always knew that the pressure would be a sort of internal and external, that there'd be something, in the wider world, in the wider landscape, or the moment they're living in, which would touch something that was very deep and intimate in their relationship. So I sort of knew that in this sort of vague way. But I'm a writer who very much makes things up as I go along. So I have little glimmers here and there. But, the writing itself engenders ideas in writing. Yeah.
That actually, I want to ask you a related quick question, because you say you make things up as you go along. Because you do use events from the world in this book, as we've described, how faithful do you have to be to what happens in the larger world, politically and all kinds of ways? How do you feel that you need to be faithful to it?
I mean, if I'm not going to be faithful, I want to make it sort of obvious. So in the 2019 section that's in Britain does stray a bit from 2019. I mean, there are, elections in the beginning of the year when Britain, they were at the end of the year. And that was my way of saying to anyone who's paying close attention, it's not quite that, for most of 2019, we had a woman prime minister. In this, there's a male prime minister from very early on. So the 2019 bit, I'm playing with it. But for instance, where I'm writing about, because Zahra works, with civil liberties, and there's a bit where there's some stuff about the kind of language and laws used against migrants and refugees, and that comes straight out of actual, government language and laws, because I'm interested in how these things actually function. So there seemed no point in making it up when, the version is there. With the 88 section, I'm pretty faithful to it. I mean, I quite like, let's invoke Hilary Mantel, the great Hilary Mantel, who we just lost, who had that wonderful line, "I'll make up a man's thoughts, but I won't make up the color of his wallpaper," which I thought was a great way to talk about writing history, that you take certain kinds of liberties, but other things you remain faithful to.
Sort of adjacent to the Jane Austen line about how she would never write a scene with two men in it, only because she didn't know what they talked about when women weren't there.
Right. Yeah.
And by the way, you had that wonderful piece about that essay about Hilary Mantel that I thought was terrific. So, okay, here's one. How do you know, or when do you know rather, when you're finished with your novels?
It's quite straightforwardly that I have nothing left to give it. When in a first draft, I do a first draft and I know the first draft is a mess. And, I know that you could say to me, well, you need to rip out this character and write 25,000 more words and completely change everything. And as long as I think it's for the good of the novel, I'll say, great, I'll go and do it. The more I work on it, the more it's this odd sense that I almost have a visual sense of a well that is filled to the brim with water when I start. And as I'm working through the drafts, there's just less and less in there. And by the final drafts, I'm working on smaller things. It's sort of moving the pieces are all there and you're sort of moving them around, and you sort of have this feeling of, I don't know how to add another piece now. I can only move the ones that are here because now they've settled. Now we've now moved from a well to a chessboard metaphor. I'm sorry, it's this is my board. These are the characters on it. I'll shift them around, but I can't make the chessboard into a Monopoly board, and I can't add a third queen.
Right. How much of the plot did you know before you started writing?
Nothing, pretty much. I mean, I did have, it's funny, for all that I start saying, I don't know where I'm going, I often know what the mood of the final sentence is, but I don't know how I come to it or quite what it says.
I'm the same way. That's interesting. I feel like we're always sort of driving a big tractor through a huge field. So we have a lot of latitude, and I know what I'm going toward and what that final thing will be, but I have no idea of how to.
Yeah. I mean, I knew it would be the two of them. I knew the first section would be Karachi 1988, and I knew that the latter section would be present day London, and I started writing it in 2019, so that was 2019. Beyond that, not a lot.
And what did you learn about friendship in general, or your own friendships in particular?
What a very good question. This is one of those very good questions. I'll tell you what, I knew, but I didn't, those things in the abstract and you don't until you feel them. What I didn't realize was the extent to which the absolute most important reader of this book was my childhood best friend, who in fact is a boy, so it's quite a different relationship. And he's a very slow reader, and when I gave him a proof over the summer, and he said, well, as you know, I'm reading very slowly, and I'm reading Jennifer Egan, and it's brilliant, but it's going to take me a while. And I said, it is brilliant, take your time. And he finally just read it, and he was sort of texting me through the beginning, just sort of things he recognized, and then he went silent for a long time. And then he just wrote to say, I completely loved it. And the way in which that mattered and was moving to me, he was writing on all my books. But I realized there was something that was very, very deep about, here we are, where he and I are almost 50 years old, we've been friends 46 years. And that way, it still feels a little like, when you were in the kindergarten, and this person you wanted to be friends with chooses you to be your friends. And you realize actually, more than even when I wrote the book that's in that book, how much with your childhood friends, your childhood self is still there. And I think that is probably one of the crucial things of why those friendships are so important, because what you're holding on to in them is yourself at a time when you had no cynicism, when you weren't jaded, when you weren't disappointed. I think I really, in the writing of this book and in my best friend's response, I sort of have felt that, and felt therefore how deep that loss is when you lose those friendships, but also that sometimes you have to lose them.
Yeah. I'm thinking of that image of earlier selves being sort of like wooden nesting dolls, kind of that you keep with inside you. But I think maybe that's true for our friends, the ones that we can keep, and we keep them with us throughout different periods. That's very moving, that detail about your friend reading it. Here's a question. So are the main struggles with the two friends their differences as they age, or is there an event? Well, we want to be careful with this one, that happens that causes their strife. P.S. Loved your novel Home Fire. So did I, which was amazing.
Thank you. Well, it's sort of, the two things are related. I mean, they are their differences, but they are navigating their way through those differences until something that happens, which, again, not too much of a spoiler, which relates back to their earlier years. Something happens that makes it impossible for them to ignore the way that they're different, because the thing about differences is we talk about them as they're abstract, and they're not abstract because they find their way into our actions and how we treat other people.
Right. When writing about characters who are placed within a backdrop of political turmoil, do you feel like putting more political elements into the narrative to see how the characters develop or react? Or do you focus on the characters and see if the political narrative can be woven through them?
it's very much, I mean, there are always things in a novel that you would like to put in, that you're interested in, and you would like to be able to say to your readers, look at this interesting thing or this terrible thing. But in the end, your fidelity has to absolutely be to the novel, which means that I think for me, it means that events have to work through the characters. There can't be an event that is happening with the characters merely standing as bystanders and it having no deeper or further effect or no reason for being other than clearly I wanted you to see this thing. So, the end of dictatorship and Benazir coming to power can't just be there as, here they are looking at it. It has to be something that enters their lives in a way, in a very personal way, and shifts something within them.
I'm wondering, actually, relatedly, some of the between stuff that you took out, was it along those lines at all? That it felt like they were kind of bystanders to things? Or was...
No, in fact, the in-between stuff was possibly had less of the political woven in, which may be part of why it didn't quite fit. And it really was, and when I look at it, it was character study stuff. It was, what are they doing when they're 21?
Right, right. Okay. Here's a last question, and it's a perfect one to end on, I think. Do you have a favorite novel that addresses friendships? Loved Home Fire, look forward to reading Best of Friends.
I do love the Elena Ferrante, and I think one thing that she's so good on, I think people don't talk about this enough because they go on to the friendship stuff, but she's so good at showing how the violence of a society seeps into the lives of people. She's a profoundly political writer. She's so interested in how those power structures get inside people and affect the way that they deal with each other and see the world. So I do love this, but the great friendship thing that I've loved recently is not in a book, but in TV. So if anyone hasn't yet seen, go and see the TV series A League of Their Own, which has this wonderful friendship in it of Max and Clancy, these two friends, and you just know they have been friends all their lives. It's just so beautifully done the way that friendship is drawn, and they have their secrets from each other. They have their separate lives. And there are things in each other that they don't entirely accept. I think it's beautifully done.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, that shorthand that friends can speak, and we are included in it in a novel or a television show or some work of art. To be included in that friendship is deeply intimate and very, very satisfying, as it is in your book. And we are out of time, I think, but it's, a joy. We met once briefly at a writers' festival in Wales, and happy to continue to have a little more detailed conversation now about writing. And your book is marvelous, as I said, and I hope everyone buys it and reads it.
Thank you, Meg. It's been a pleasure. And thank you for letting us into your living room.
Of course, anytime.
And from all of us at Politics and Prose, thank you both for joining us, and thank you all, everyone out there, for being with us. Your patronage is what allows us to host programming like this, and we can't continue to do it without the book sales to support it. So as a gentle reminder, I have dropped the link to the book in the chat. It takes you directly to the Politics and Prose website. While you're there, I hope you'll check out our events page. We'd love to see you there soon at another event soon. We do have in-person as well as virtual events going on right now. In the meantime, thank you both so much for such a lovely conversation, and stay well and well read.
Thank you.
Thank you.